I'd like to introduce myself and to say that I'm not a historian, I'm not an engineer, nor am I a journalist, but I can claim to be a social scientist interested in international multidisciplinary comparative research, especially when it has a policy dimension. I think you'll see some of that today. More importantly, though, I've lived in Monck Street for nearly 20 years, and I know that a lot of other people, you might not live actually in Monck Street, but you certainly live in the surrounding area. I soon realised when I moved here that there was a lot to find out about New Palace Place, and I was already interested in the history of the building, so I've been making excellent use of the Thorny Island and the Westminster archives, and practically all the prints and things that are available here in books or in other ways. So, just to show you where we are, the two stars indicate where the two archives are. The first is the second in a three-part story about Monck Street. And the first part was what's in the name, examined how Monck Street got its name in 1898 from one of the past overseers of the poor who gifted a tobacco box for his colleagues in 1713. And his name was Henry Monck, so it's not General George Monck, as many people believe, and no relation, as far as I can ascertain, to anybody else who's known about it. There's several of you actually attended the event in November at Westminster City Hall, in which we presented the story of the tobacco box. And we have on display at the back the full version of the account of the tobacco box, and that's going to be made available online. And there's also a video of the event which Robert has put on the Thorny Island Society website. Part two, which is what we're interested in today, it looks at what's behind the name of Monck Street, focusing on the purpose of this talk on the origins and story of the Westminster Gasworks, which brought gas lighting to London streets. And again, there's a summary of the main story there on that. Part three, what's beneath the name, is the subject and focus of the third part, where we will be looking at the tunnels and war rooms, which are also underneath Monck Street. And that was actually the topic which originally sparked my interest in Monck Street as a historical group. Today, what I'm going to do is run through a series of questions and try and provide answers to them. The first question is, why did Westminster need a gasworks? The second one is, how did Gaslight and Coke Company actually try and harness street lighting? The third one was the potential for the harnessing street lighting. The fourth one was, how did the Light, Gas and Coke Company obtain the Royal Charter? I'm using cool gas and coke gas, not quite interchangeably here in the talk. Both are byproducts created when coal is heated in the absence of oxygen. And historically, cool gas was used to power street lamps, and coke gas was for more industrial purposes. And they actually produced different colours of light. We go on after looking at the charter to how were the challenges in actually building the gasworks resolved, and how did the Westminster Gasworks fall from peak to decline, and coming finally to why is the story of the Westminster Gasworks relevant to us today. So my first question, why did Westminster need a gasworks? In 1622, Streets, London and Westminster Act gave inhabitants responsibility for paving and cleaning the streets outside their homes. In 1762, London and Westminster Paving Act appointed commissioners responsible for paving, fencing and lighting streets in Westminster. Residents who were ratepayers were required to subscribe to the public provision of streetlights. Then, in 1768, the necessity for some more effectual system was recognised to be provided by public authorities to reduce the amount of criminality in the area at night, greatly owing to the insufficient lighting of the streets. There are some resonance in that as well today, as many of you will know in this area when the gasworks were going on, it was quite dangerous. So, link boys were actually employed in the late 18th century to carry a flaming torch or lantern to light the way for the wealthy pedestrians at night. They could actually also be part of the problem, described as something worse than a nuisance when they engaged in pickpocketing. The wealthy man is putting his coins into the hat, but quite often it worked the other way around. The link boys were actually removing their value. Then by 1793, there are actually 220 globular gas lamps with oil and cotton and 2 burners. And for lamp lighters, oil cap lamps presented actually a hazard that could result in the loss of life, and there are accounts of them falling off the ladders and even falling into the river. So, sorry. But dissatisfaction continued for decades, and it was clear that a different approach was going to be needed to satisfy the inhabitants of the process. So my second question is, how did coal gas lighting come to us? Well, there were 3 influential figures who appear regularly in the literature about the transition from oil to gas for public street lighting in English towns and the city, and they are William Murdoch, also often spelled with a K, in Scottish origin, Samuel Clegg, and then Frederick Albert Windsor. His name was anglicised, you'll find out, from Friedrich Albrecht Windsor when he settled in London. Each of these had their own particular talents and personalities. I'm going to ask James to introduce them to you.
William Murdoch was born in Ayrshire and moved down to Birmingham at the age of 23 to work for the firm of Bolton and Watts Soho Manufacturing near Birmingham, which figures prominently in our story today. Murdoch has been described as a chemist, inventor, mechanical and gas engineer, Britain's most underrated engineer, the Scot who lit the world, and a philosophical investigator. The key invention for which Murdoch is best known in the context for this talk is his application of coal gas lighting as a replacement for light produced from oil and tallow. Murdoch is said to have discovered how coal gas could be used for lighting. He piped it from an apparatus in his yard to light his house in Cornwall, where he lived when he was working in a project for his employer. The wall plaque tells us that he made his first locomotive here and tested it in 1784, and invented gas lighting and used it in the house in 1792. Murdoch House was perhaps dubiously recognised as a world origin site, credited for having been the world's first building lit by gas. Murdoch's gasometer, installed in the Bolton and Watts Soho foundry, Handsworth, Birmingham, 1798, more properly referred to as a gas holder, although the early versions could serve as measuring cylinders. Next, we have Samuel Clegg. He was born in Manchester and was apprenticed to Murdoch. In 1805, Clegg set up a gas engineer on his own account before being engaged by the mill owner Henry Lodge to install a gas lighting system in his cotton mills at Sowerby Bridge near Halifax, thereby enabling the firm to extend working hours. He later returned to Bolton and Watt. Clegg was author of a seminal work, 1841, a practical treatise of the manufacture and distribution of coal gas, its introduction and progressive improvements. Clegg's inventions: horizontal rotary retort, revolving gas holder, plus a system for metering gas. These inventions illustrate Clegg's problem-solving skills, which we'll talk about more later on. And then finally, we have Albert Windsor. Windsor was born in Brunswick, in Germany, and was occupied in banking and commerce in Frankfurt, where he heard about Philip Le Bon's invention of gas lighting and heating in Paris. Le Bon initially produced his gas by heating sawdust. He later obtained a patent for a thermolamp, which burned gas distilled from wood. On trips to France and England, Windsor, who had changed his name, presumably to avoid prejudice against foreigners, was looking for inventions in need of financing and development. In 1803, he arrived in London with a master plan for gas lighting, where he gained a reputation as an entrepreneurial visionary deficient in chemical knowledge and technical skill. Although Windsor died in Paris and was buried at Père Lachaise Cemetery, subsequently a monument was erected to him in Kensal Green Cemetery.
Right, so we can move on to our third question. So, how was the potential of rural gas street lighting harnessed? Well, Windsor began campaigning for the use of gas for public street lighting in the capital. He lectured at the Lyceum Theatre in London and distributed lots of pamphlets, and he made quite exaggerated claims and wild prognostications about the value of gas.
For example, his gas is to be scentless, a cure for asthma and all pulmonary troubles, and conducive to a vigorous growth in plants, since it will generate the elements required for the sustenance in much greater proportion than even the most powerful action of solar rays can possibly produce in the common operations of nature.
You get the feel for his exaggeration capacities. He did actually obtain not a patent for his inventions, and it's said to be one of the first for gas lighting. He's experimented and made public demonstrations, and we're going to give you examples of these, and he raised funding for a gas lighting company.
Here we see Windsor lecturing at the Lyceum Theatre. I think the Lion King's on there now, isn't it?
Yes, it's been on for a long time.
Due to his indifferent English, Windsor engaged Edward Hurd as a chemical assistant to read for him. And you see him in the well below there. And he helped conduct his experiments. But Hurd proved to be unreliable, and Windsor dismissed him, only to discover that Hurd had carried off his manuscript and was travelling around country towns, reading lectures prepared by Windsor without his knowledge.
Okay.
That's like plagiarism, isn't it?
It is. It would be today. This is one of 4 satirical prints that we have managed to get the images of. You won't be able to read the thread, but if subsequently you're able to access the print, you can read what's written on them. We'll give you some little extracts, but they're all 4 of them on the banner. Even close up, you have to have good eyesight to be able to read them, but it does certainly repay scrutiny, and I'd strongly advise you to try and get a look at them. So one of the speech balloons in that first one has resonance again with our situation today.
Yes, it says, "You are so frequently breaking up the pavement that there is no such thing as walking the streets upon clean legs without a pair of stilts."
Right, the more seriously, Windsor was also exercising his talents and skills at demonstrating coal gaslighting. And this is a map from a book which I thoroughly recommend to anybody. And there are lots of things which we're showing you which are taken actually out of this book. And the account is one of the best, I think. It was fascinating, I've read. Anyway, this is the gaslighting on the wall of Carlton House Gardens. And it was probably first lit on the 28th of January 1807. There's some dispute about the date, but I think the chronology that I'm trying to present is fairly near. The gas was piped underground from Port Pall Mall, and that's where Windsor lived. So you've got the arrow above the A Mall, which indicates where his house was. And he had quite well-to-do neighbours because the Prince of Wales Gardens at Carlton House were just below where he lived. And so he piped gas from furnaces in his yard in Pall Mall along underground and along the wall down to the corner between Marlborough House and Carlton House Gardens, and then along the wall below of the actual garden wall. And when he had this display, the lamps were lit at 8 in the evening and continued to burn until nearly midnight, to great delight of the crowd. So that was a great success. And there's a green plaque, and if you're interested in tracking down green plaques, in Pall Mall, there's a tiny little plaque on the wall there, which is on number 100, which isn't actually where he ever lived. He did have 3 houses in Pall Mall, but the numbers have changed over the years. And the lights in Carlton House Gardens actually preceded a series of experiments and displays in Pall Mall during that same year. And Windsor lit up Pall Mall allegedly for illuminations on the King's George III's birthday on the 4th of June 1807. We go back to another of these satirical prints.
A peep at the gaslights in Pall Mall. Windsor had to seek permission not only from the Prince of Wales to stage his public demonstrations, but also from the paving commissioners, which was not always so easily obtained.
You remember that paving commissioner? It was. So Windsor's original lamps erected in Pall Mall was in 1807, and this is a diorama, just something I discovered, and there are copies of here and in the Science Museum, which are very interesting. I've got more to show you. So eventually there were 13 lamps which were erected along the south side of Pall Mall. And by 1810, Windsor was operating 2 large and 4 small furnaces from his premises in Pall Mall, Lawrence set up his business there, which I don't think was very popular with neighbours.
The rationale behind replacing oil lamps with coal gas was that it produced a brighter light with less soot, and due to centralised production, had the potential to be cheaper, as argued by Windsor. The downside came from it being toxic from the carbon monoxide and from the significant risk of explosion. Windsor continued to face opposition to his project on the grounds of danger to life and limb through explosions and from health because of the noxious fumes.
Which are very clearly illustrated in those 2 dark prints. So, more seriously, how did the Gaslight and Coke Company obtain the World Champ? That was not easy. So in 1807, there was a meeting of Windsor supporters at the Crown and Anchor in the Strand, and he faced quite a lot of opposition, very local opposition, from oil lamp producers, needless to say, to the whale fishermen who feared the loss of their trade, from companies like Bolton and Watt, which had been doing their own thing but hadn't thought it was particularly advantageous to go down the route of gas lighting streets at that time. We see how that changed. The Royal Society, which you probably all know about, who ridiculed the venture, and then also public authorities who feared that threat to competition. And besides his bombastic pamphlets and advertisements and events like the Pall Mall display, at the close of the year, still in 1807, Windsor issued a flaming prospectus floating the new patriotic Imperial and National Light and Heat Company. That's his name for it, typical of his name. And again, this book has got copies of the pamphlets and all the correspondence that was raging backwards and forwards, and obviously the press at that time was very lively as well, so you regularly had reports on the incidents which he produced. So a fund was then set up to assist Mr. Windsor with his experiments. Investors led by James Grant, whose name will appear as well, petitioned for an Act of Parliament to launch a public venture.
The Provisional Committee acting on behalf of the subscribers published a very temperately worded plea in favour of the company's aims, wisely disclaiming any originality for Windsor's scheme, and frankly disavowing their belief in his estimate of profits. I quote now, "His publications indeed are but ill adapted to promote his cause, and the exaggerated calculations which the sanguine mind of a discoverer is naturally disposed to indulge in have, to superficial observers, thrown an air of ridicule and improbability on the whole scheme." End quote. 1809 and 1810 applications for incorporation of the National Light and Heat Company. Windsor was left feeling that his pioneer work was being threatened by the far-seeing enterprise of a wittier rival. Bolton and Watt had used all their financial, scientific and technological resources and their political supporters to outwit Windsor when they realised where their interests lay. Now, you might be wondering at this point what's happened to Murdoch during this time. Given his loyalty to the firm and his philosophical approach to the work, Bolton and Watt used his scientific reputation, including an award-winning paper from the Royal Society, to present a strong case against Windsor.
That in fact, Windsor did not write the paper, but that's a topic which is addressed in one of the source materials we're looking at. So, I'm not going to read this through, but just to give you an indication of the sort of process that we had to go through to try and get the Royal Charter. And so people who had got involved, the Chancellor of His Majesty's Exchequer, His Majesty's Most Honourable Privy Council, His Majesty in person, the Attorney, His Majesty's Attorney and Solicitor General, and they were all getting involved in deciding that an Act of Parliament would be necessary to carry through this project. So that was all going on in 1810, 1812, and this is all related to what was happening right at the beginning when I was talking about getting public street lighting. So there are a lot of centuries or decades were going by without the project being real. But eventually, in 2012, it was first called the National Heat and Light Company. It changed its name quickly to the Gas, Light and Coke Company for incorporation, and this was the that they used. And my Latin tells me that spet capitolium frugens is taken from owed by horror, and that it meant, well, Latin scholars here, let their capital stand green. Quite an ambitious charge. No, but we're not there yet. So how were the challenges in building the gasworks we thought? Well, there were obviously technical and practical issues. First one was the management of the company, and this is where Grant stepped in and became the governor of the company. Windsor's input had dwindled, and he had become more of a hindrance to the company than any practical use. But Clegg was of much greater use to the company, and he became chief engineer between 1812 and 1817. But also, this was a period that historians will tell you that the early years of the company were actually marked by quite desperate straits, because the works coincided with the Napoleonic Wars and then the Luddites' actions in 1811. 1813. So the next problem was relocating the headquarters.
The nascent company originally set up their offices in Pall Mall, where Windsor continued to live until 1814, and their first establishment was in Cannon Row, both of which proved to be unsuitable. Urged by Clegg to find a more propitious site, the factory moved to the Great Peter Street site, which was also problematic. When gas was first generally introduced in about 1812 to 1813, the most absurd fears of the new illuminant were held by the public. An eminent engineer gravely told the House of Commons that the gas pipes would spread conflagration from house to house and street to street. Clegg had to light the lamps on Westminster Bridge because the gaslighters refused to do so after an explosion. Abused by the users, on whose consumption there was practically no check, save by a system of spying being largely responsible for these lean years. For it must be borne in mind that there were no meters in use in the early days of gas. And in 1815, Clegg resolved the problem of abuse by inventing a means of metering gas volumes, which he subsequently refined.
Right, so we managed, by a few years later, after 1812, to set up the headquarters of the officers in Horseferry Road, and they had the head office and the showrooms. Then, following Clegg's instructions and advice, gas production was actually moved from Pall Mall, which wasn't a very good place to have it, to the site of what was a market garden and tea gardens between Great Peter Street and Horseferry Road. And those of you who are aware of the first part in the story will know that originally Monk Street had another name, which you'll see in some of the plans, but it was a tea garden, basically. And so this is when you get an industrial establishment replacing a tea garden. The middle image is one which reproduces all over the place, and that's taken actually from the inside of the gasworks. And currently you can actually see the retorts in the background. And that is a picture of the retorts, because everybody asks, and that's where all the action happened. That's where they put in the cooling, the gas was produced and filtered and purified, etc. So those three pictures, again, they're all in here, and in some. This is also something which I discovered when I came to find this book, which is a plan of the Gaslight and Coke Company's works in 1859, although I gather that it was also in that same form 10 or so years earlier. But what's quite interesting, I've just put a few little indicators here, but you can recognise gas holders, the retorts, not a lot of them, but they also had stores and various other workshops and offices. So it was quite a big industrial work. And the actual height of gasworks, and this is in 1850s, but you can see here, I don't know when you can point, James, that the Monk Street was still not called Monk Street at that stage, so you still got the part where there were the tea gardens, visitors' ground, as it's called, you still got that. What I found quite intriguing is if you look parallel to what was actually Marsham Street, there's a thing called the laundry yard, and I don't know whether any of you are aware of that, what that was, because I found that quite intriguing. And doesn't say it's like I might say here, it was actually a slum housing Irish labourers who worked for the company, and the women did their washing in a stream or ditch, which was a tributary to the Tiber and Thorny Island, and tell you about that, which ran actually along the side of the yard. So you had a slum, you had the gasworks right near all Westminster and etc. Parliament. But what's interesting in this, and it illustrates later on, is that the distance between the gasworks and the river, where they had to get the coal in and they had to get the effluent out, it was too far. And there was a huge problem of how you get effluent moving in the alleyways and roads, and eventually that was something again which Clegg was going to resolve.
Yeah, there was no immediate access to the river, and so the delivery of coal and disposal of waste and byproducts had to be done by the road. In 1817, this problem was partially solved by the laying of a pipe of effluent down to the river, as Linda just said. At Westminster, the waterlogged subsoil prevented the sinking of gas holder tanks beneath the surface, and the never-failing ingenuity of Mr. Clegg was called upon to decide how to store the gas by other means.
So you saw earlier on his inventions, and that's where they picked up. So let's move on. How did the Westminster Gasworks fall from peak to decline? The installations were pretty primitive. It just looked like that. And they used brewers' vats as gas holders at one point, and they used timber instead of brick in construction in the later models because that was cheaper. No dividends were actually paid by the company until 1817. So all these people had been generously investing without much return. In 1817, both Clegg and Windsor actually moved on, although the production of gas was increased, again, largely thanks to all the work that Clegg had put in. To say Windsor already favoured fame. So at that stage, I'll just run through this quickly to show you the contrast. These are the figures again, which lots of the provides. So you start off with just the one gas holder. You remember that round circle, big circle. 1822 had 300 retorts, 15 gas holders, 57 miles of mains, 2,248 working gas lamps, 20 plus provincial companies. By 1842, you've got 600 retorts, 20 gas holders, 120 miles of mains, pipes, and then those like the full works again, the extended in 1853. What had happened actually in between is that in 1848 works had been rebuilt and another wharf had been released in Millbank for deliveries. And then the site was extended, and it was actually enlarged, taking in part of that laundry yard. And then in 1870, it was sort of more or less in its peak production. The company had become the first gas undertaking in the world concerned chiefly until the 1880s with production of gas for lighting purposes. And unlike most of the other gas companies, none of the Westminster works was directly served by water or rail, which we've already mentioned, but that was critical. The company then decided to build a larger and more accessible gas-making facility at Beckton, where colliers could be brought right up to the works, and from where gas could be taken to central London by trunk main. So this is just a couple of images of the site as it came, and by this time you can see that Monck Street has got its name. You can see there are two gas orders because the gas production actually ceased and the site was cleared. So it was still used for holding gas, but it didn't produce gas. And this is a couple of images. And as you came in, I hope you noticed on the right, this lovely wall painting by Jill of the gas holders. So it was actually on the announcement of the programme, but it's lovely to look at it. And that's another image. So the end of production is, as you know, if you look on the wall of the Home Office, how many of you have seen that plaque on the wall of the Home Office? It's very dirty. I don't know if you noticed that. And that's a much cleaner version, but the actual wall image is not terribly clean. So that is what remains. So 1813 to 1837. And it was the first public supply of gas in the world. There are all these claims about being the first. You search very hard, you find that other countries are also in the game. So why is the story of the Westminster Gasworks relevant to us today? Well, more than 2 centuries after the first gas lines came to Westminster, many of you are aware of this, 270 of the capital's 1,300 surviving gas lamps are located in Westminster. And as you go around Westminster, the one on the left is actually in Smith Square, and the one on the right is in Green Park. And during the day, those are actually lit in Green Park. You ever notice? And in the middle, you've got the gas lighter. It goes up his ladder, and the ladder usually stays around in the area. And he cleans it and sets the time and again. So he doesn't like everyone. But the main reason why you know about Monck Street and the gasworks is because in March 2025, this notice was distributed to most inhabitants in the area, demonstrating that they're going to replace all these gas pipes. We have a historian of gasworks here, so he might be able to tell us how much had to be replaced in between the actual building and now. But you can see that Monck Street is really highlighted as being the place which is going to suffer most from the replacement of the gasworks, and actually major works. And so they announced it in March. They couldn't start straight away because there was a gas leak in Peter Street, so it didn't actually start till June, correct me if I'm wrong. And it was finished on the 2nd of May this year, which I'm terribly pleased about. But it's done, and these are taken from the LinkedIn site of one of the engineering firms, which is rather involved. And they've supplied, well, they said I could use these pictures, and I've just taken some script. I'm not going to read it to you, but just to remind you of what we're talking about. And you would have seen at the other end of Monck Street, of course, very road end, these tents appeared, and we wondered what on earth was going on. Is there anybody who lives at that end of Monck Street? Yes, so you know all about that. Yes, which was a very joyful experience. And I didn't know whether this would stop us seeing what was going on, or whether it really was to protect them from the weather. That's what they claimed. And these were the pipes that they put in, which are absolutely huge. and they're supposed to be, I don't know how long they last, but they're supposed to be much stronger, obviously, than what was replaced. So, and then they announced with great glee that they'd actually got to the end of the works, and this was the Tesco's for Chinese restaurant end, where you would have seen that they made that awful lot of work. And they ended up with a nice clean street. Well, there's still some rubbish about today. Anyway, so that's the story of the Gasworks, and I should like to just give my thanks to all these people who have been so friendly and helpful, collaborative in getting this all together. So, James, firstly, captions are playwright, and not quite playwright, but we might convert this into a play. Quite a lot of good dialogue there. And the support that we received, particularly from Westminster, has been incredible, especially from Amanda on Jones, who unfortunately be here, and also Rory Lowen, who helped make the banner, and who's been around for quite a long time. He knows where everything is in the archive. It's brilliant. And Thorn Young Society Archives, what about Frank? Had to leave, but it's still the main archivist, I would say, at Thorn Young Society. And Hari, that she is sitting hiding away there. She has been such a fantastic support for getting this event off the ground. I'd like to offer my special thanks to her. I also discovered that the Institution of Civil Engineers, and Clegg was actually a member of the Institution of Civil Engineers, they were very helpful in covering some of the books and obscure documents which I hadn't got. Isaac Holmeston is a chemical engineer who actually lives in the same building as I do. He's been very helpful in explaining some of the intricacies of the workings and equipment of the Gasworks. And then Christy Murray is the managing director who has supplied the images. And finally, I'd like to thank the St Andrew's Youth Club, which is right next door to the Thorney Island archives. And they have generously lent us their audio equipment, which has been very helpful. I hope that you've all been able to hear what I've been saying. But I discovered, looking them up on the web, Westminster City of the Youth Club was actually the first youth club in the world, can I say? It started in 1866. So again, the same sort of period. Anyone interested in just tracking how many things there are in the Westminster area which have merited world-class status, that's another project that we could